Hello, and welcome to Zilog and Moto, the YouTube channel dedicated to the review of each and every English language game for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega CD, and 32X. And yes, I know, in Europe and Japan it's a Mega CD, not a Sega CD. Do I need to mention the Master System was originally the Mark III as well? Yeah, probably not. You're a smart bunch out there. In all seriousness though, a few years ago, after finding a few Master System games at a local Goodwill, I had a thought. The Sega Genesis was my favorite console growing up, and I'd always been curious about the Master System, as I had a few friends and acquaintances that had them, especially one that had the Power Base Converter, the device that allows you to play Master System games on the Genesis. So I decided, what the heck, I'm going to start collecting retro games with the goal of getting every game that played on a Genesis via some sort of add-on or converter. Well, every game I could understand anyway, so Japanese releases are off the table. Mostly. However, I didn't want to just buy a bunch of plastic. I already had tons of newer games. I wanted to really experience each of these games, and I thought, what better way to do that than to document playing all of them on YouTube, and here we are, 3 years later, and having reviewed over 142 games. If this sounds interesting to you, I ask that you think about subscribing, as that way you'll know when I post new videos, and it'll help other people see the channel as well. In this week's video, it's sequel time, which, honestly, there's a lot of when we're looking at these consoles, so it's not too surprising. Back in episode 43, I picked out and reviewed Hard Drivin for the Genesis, Tengen's port of the arcade classic. Now, I can already feel people out there mocking me for saying that Hard Drive is a classic, but two things in my defense. One, I'm specifically referring to the arcade game, and not one of the many home ports of the game, including that Genesis version. Believe it or not, they got much worse than the Genesis port. Okay, and number two, as far as that arcade version goes, you have to understand what it was like in the early days of 3D games. As bad as Hard Drivin might seem in 2022, when it was originally released in 1989, it was revolutionary, especially if you got to play the deluxe sit-down version, and as a result, it was one of Atari's last true arcade hits. Well, when an arcade game is a hit, what happens? You get a sequel, sometimes great, but oftentimes hastily designed, that allows arcade operators to simply swap out a board and some labels and wait for the quarters to roll in again without actually having to buy a whole new cabinet. So where does Race Drivin fit into that equation? Well, there were certainly some upgrade kits for existing hard driving cabinets sold on the market that were much cheaper than what a dedicated machine would cost, but there were some technical differences between the two machines as well, with Race Drivin utilizing a more powerful chip loadout to allow the game to perform better, especially with multiple vehicles on screen, and along with simply performing better, the game also had new cars and tracks added to it to attempt to draw Hard Drivin fans back in with something new to conquer. Race Drivin wasn't as popular as the original, even with those upgrades, but it was still notable enough to get the home port treatment, with Tengen taking a few years, but eventually releasing this Genesis version in 1993. So, did waiting a few years to port the game help to improve it from their previous effort with Hard Drivin? Or is this definitely a case of too little and far too late? Well, we'll see, but first a look at the package. And this is my copy of Race Drivin, so that we can take a closer look at what you were getting when you picked this up back in 1993, but I'm going to stop for a second. You see, in previous videos, I had broken down the condition of the game, and then later the manual, but after thinking about it some and some comments on Reddit, I think I'm going to drop that, as who really cares what my specific copy looks like? I guess initially I thought that talking about that stuff could potentially give collectors an idea of what to look for when buying a copy for themselves, but the more I thought about it, it's maybe just too indulgent, so let's move on. For the Genesis version of Race Drivin, the cover has the Race Drivin logo at the top, and then underneath the cover is based on the artwork from the original promotional materials for the arcade game. I think this is a good choice, and even though you only get a portion of that original photo, it focuses on the most important part, with the man barely able to control an actual race driving cabinet, destroying anything in its path. Honestly, it makes the game look far more exciting than it is, but depending on how you look at it, that's a good thing, as it's definitely going to draw the kids in.
Although, I think the tie might be overkill. What, was this guy on his morning commute and then all of a sudden found himself in the middle of a race on I-55? Finally, Race Drivin is one of those titles with a totally useless VRC rating at the bottom, indicating that it's okay for general audiences. Probably the most objectionable content in the game consists of the low frame rate, but you can't really hand out a MA13 for that. Can you? Flipping over the back, and you'll see a rear layout very similar to that of Gauntlet 4 that I looked at in last week's video, which makes sense considering that both of these titles were released in 1993, and Tengen didn't tend to get too adventurous with their graphic design. And that's okay, simple is fine, and the 4 screenshots used here are all decent quality, although they look a bit odd. Can you pick up on the issue? Take a look at the screen shape for all of them. They're all pretty rectangular and actually look more like a screenshot from today's widescreen 16:9 televisions instead of the more square display from a standard CRT of the day. So I'll be interested to see why that is when I get to the review section, since it doesn't appear that any of the screen is cut off. Opening the package up, and here's the manual for the game, and after last week's fairly thick manual for Gauntlet 4, this manual is much more representative of what you would get with a Tengen game on the Genesis, with it only having 8 pages of real content. The content that is here, it's fine, but it's definitely on the cheap side, with not a single screenshot from the game included, no diagrams, nothing. Just a fairly bare-bones explanation of how to play the game, with a brief explanation of the few options that were included, and then finally some nearly useless tips that seem to be included just so that the last page of the manual didn't seem quite so empty. One thing that stands out to me is the fact that while the ability to create a custom track is mentioned, there's literally nothing in here about how that mode works or what your options are in that mode. Oh well, it's clear that Gauntlet 4 was the exception to the rule as far as Tengen releases were concerned. Okay, that's the package. Let's get to the game and see if this is just a warmed over version of Hard Drivin, or if perhaps there's been some significant improvements. When Atari released Race Drivin in the arcades, the goal was clear: strike while the Hard Drivin iron was hot, and release a new version of the game that was already similar enough to the original so that arcade operators had some options if they had already invested in a Hard Drivin cabinet, but that also had enough new things to attract players back to the game that had already mastered the original. Honestly, a pretty common line of thinking when it comes to arcade titles that might have occurred more times than you realize with other series of games. Capcom was notorious for this with the Street Fighter series, case in point the 3 different versions of Street Fighter 3 that are all really the same base game, but each just adding enough new features to keep players coming back to the Street Fighter 3 platform until the true sequel, Street Fighter 4, was released. So, having said all that, how does Race Drivin compare to the original Hard Drivin? Well, to go along with that previous Street Fighter 3 analogy, I think there's a reason why it's called Race Drivin and not Hard Drivin 2. To be sure, the arcade version of Race Drivin did have some features that the original didn't have, including the addition of 2 new cars and 2 new tracks. If you want to play through the stunt track from the original Hard Drivin with the original car, referenced to as the Sportster, you can do that, and benefit from the improved performance of the updated arcade hardware. But if you want to be more adventurous and actually play Race Drivin utilizing its additional features, you can do that as well by either choosing the Speedster or Roadster vehicle instead, with the caveat being you have to use manual shifting for those vehicles, or by choosing the Autocross or Super Stunt tracks to race on instead. Race Drivin even supported a linked mode competition, where a well-funded arcade operator could connect 2 Race Drivin cabinets together so that 2 players could race against each other in live competition, as opposed to taking on a ghost of a competitor. These new features that have been added to the arcade version are decent, but the 2 main reasons to play Race Drivin over Hard Drivin are the increased performance in the game and the new Super Stunt track, which takes the stunt track from the original and ratchets up the intensity level with a few additions of treacherous mountain curves, a corkscrew, and a tunnel with a nasty surprise for first-time players. Due to the addition of this new Super Stunt track and the better on-screen performance, I could definitely see fans of Hard Drivin coming back for more, even if the experience is somewhat short-lived for Hard Drivin veterans, as it won't take too long to figure out the tricks of the new track. But all that is in reference to the arcade version specifically. What about the Genesis version, since that's the true subject of today's review? Well, let's start out with the positives. First, the Genesis version enhances the arcade experience by now allowing you to choose the two new cars, but race them utilizing an automatic transmission instead of just a manual, effectively giving you 6 car options instead of just 4. Along with that, the Genesis version also includes an interesting track creation mode, which allows you to, create your own track, and then race on it, for when you get bored of the other 3 tracks from the arcade version. And finally, there are a few options included, such as difficulty selection, the choice to display kilometers per hour instead of miles per hour, a traffic selector which sets which side of the road you drive on, and even a practice mode that can be switched on if you don't want to be bothered by silly things such as timers or traffic, and just learn the tracks. Okay, well, that all sounds good, right? Let's break all that down further. First off, that options screen, it's not nearly as useful as you think, and that's assuming you can even find the thing. The first time I played the game, it took me about 30 minutes to figure out how to even access it. I knew it was supposed to exist because I did glance over the manual, but silly me, I was expecting it to stand out like a normal option screen where you would actually select it at the beginning of a game from a menu. Like 98% of other games on the market. I accidentally hit the A button one time at the beginning of the game instead of hitting start, and then stumbled onto it. To Tengen's credit, it does say this in the manual, so had I actually read closer I would have known this, so that's somewhat on me, but good luck to anyone trying to play the game without the manual. This experience did ring a faint bell for me, so I went back to look at Hard Drivin, and sure enough, it operates exactly the same way. What's up with them hiding the options menu? However, beyond the options screen not being obvious to get to, the options included are pretty useless. For instance, the options for kilometers per hour and utilizing left side drive. Well, those would be great if the game was released in Japan or Europe, but it wasn't, as Race Drivin was a US exclusive on the Genesis, like many other Tengen releases. Beyond that, as far as the practice mode goes, I don't know why you would ever need that, as the game's pretty simple, and you'll learn each of the tracks after a few attempts. And all the difficulty mode does is drop or raise the time limits and has no actual effect on gameplay. Well, at least there's the ever-useful sound test, I guess. Let's move on to the additional cars. Now, before I get too critical about the cars, I want to be clear, I do like having the additional cars, and I like how you're not restricted to using manual transmission anymore. But when actually playing the game, I could not tell the difference between any of the cars, and it seemed like the only way you knew if you'd picked a certain car was when it was displayed during a crash replay. Apparently, in the arcade version, the Sportster, i.e. the original red car, is the most balanced of the 3, with the Roadster, the green car, being the slowest but having the best steering, and the Speedster, the yellow car that the arcade cabinet was based on, is the fastest but having the worst handling. Also, each of the cars are supposed to get a performance bump if you choose the manual version over the automatic. However, I only know all of this because of a fact that I found online for the Super Nintendo version, and in this case, this is not a case of me failing to read the manual. For this subject, the manual states, and I quote, "Each car has its own characteristics, which you'll get to know as you drive them all." Boy, thanks, Tengen. Now, it is possible that the cars perform slightly different, and to their credit, if I'd played the game for another hour or two and really concentrated on that, I probably would have teased it out. However, there's a bigger problem here. The reason why I can't tell the difference between how the cars perform, just from a cursory playthrough, is because of how awful the frame rate is. This was one of the problems in Hard Drivin, and it's still a problem here, with a playthrough of the original stunt track and Race Drivin being more or less indistinguishable from the first game. There's a few things that make this frustrating. The first is, you may remember me mentioning the screenshots on the back of the box appearing to be in widescreen. Well, those screenshots are accurate, as a trick that the developers used to get the performance that they did was to narrow the game's display area by not using the full screen. and this is after it was already shrunk with the presence of the car's dashboard at the bottom of the screen. After comparing it to the Super Nintendo version though, I suppose it could have been a lot worse. Seriously, go check out a video on that to see a real atrocity. Using graphical tricks to get increased 3D performance on hardware without 3D acceleration isn't my biggest gripe, and as I mentioned, it could be worse. My main problem is the fact that the game engine seems unchanged from Hard Drivin. Hard Drivin was released for the Genesis in December of 1990. Race Drivin? Almost 3 full years later in November of 1993. Do you really expect me to believe that developers learned nothing over that 3 years that could have produced a better looking game? Really? Sadly, it appears that the developer of the Genesis version of the titles, Polygames, who was originally known as Sterling Silver Software and probably more famous for their work on the Electronic Arts PGA Tour Golf Series, had basically just taken their Hard Drivin code out of mothballs and threw the additional race driving features onto the game that they'd already built, rather than actually trying to keep up with the times and improve the game. This may be one of those situations where Tengen just wanted an additional title out for a Christmas release in 1993, and as such, Polygames wasn't exactly given much time or money to work with, so I don't want to fully put the blame on them, but the end result is not impressive. Polygames certainly wouldn't be the first developer to reuse an existing game engine for a new game. It happens all the time, and honestly these days it's the reason why we have as many games as we do, because it would be impossible to have all these titles exist if the developers had to start from the ground up every time. However, even with those reused engines, usually they're at least tweaked a bit, bug fixes, increased performance, etc. None of that seems to be the case here, which ends up causing problems on the newly implemented Super Stunt Track. As the name indicates, the Super Stunt Track, which is Race Drivin's prime moneymaker, is a track that goes well above and beyond the original stunt track from a design perspective. You may remember earlier that I mentioned how the track contains a mountain section, a tunnel, and a corkscrew, and it even has a jump that goes through a disconnected loop. But you would only know about the corkscrew if you played the Genesis version, and even the corkscrew is pretty rough, with the game chugging at a speedy 1 frame per second during that section. And that's not an exaggeration. The disconnect loop section is intact, although it's implemented in blink and you'll miss it fashion, and the tunnel is completely removed, which confused the hell out of me because the track map still shows it. However, the tunnel being gone made sense when I realized the larger issue with the track, and that was the mountain was gone. Yes, one of the main integral features to the track just isn't there, and instead, the track seemingly randomly just goes up into the sky for a section with no guardrails on the sides, and the most ridiculous sight, a farmhouse on the side of the track apparently floating in midair. After watching gameplay of the arcade version, this oddly altered version of the Super Stunt Track made a bit more sense, as my brain could somewhat fill in the blanks, so to speak, but I could just imagine being a kid that had never played the arcade version, thinking that this was the most ridiculous game in the world because they didn't have that background. The game plays more or less how you'd expect, with A for gas, B for brake, C for manual shifting, and the D-pad for steering, and they all feel sluggish due to the overall awful frame rate. It's not uncommon to totally blow a turn due to not being able to brake fast enough. And the sounds in the game are rudimentary at best, with the most common audio being poorly implemented engine noise and tire screeching. Honestly, I think the thing I liked the best about the game was the create a track function, where when messing around I accidentally created a section of 4 loops in a row, which was fun to go through. But the track editor itself is simplistic to a fault, and of course there's no way to save your track designs, or anything else for that matter, due to the lack of any kind of password or battery backup system. Back in Season 1, I gave Hard Drivin 1 star when I reviewed it, and 3 years later I really don't think anything has changed. Race Drivin is a sad affair that pales in comparison to the already somewhat bare-bones arcade game. I refuse to award Race Drivin a bomb rating, as I really try to reserve that for games that are simply broken, but there's no reason to play this game in 2022, except for maybe on a lark on a stream or something. As a result, like Hard Drivin before it, I'm giving Race Drivin 1 star. If you're really curious about playing Race Drivin, rather than any of the 16-bit ports, I recommend taking a look at the version included in Midway Arcade Treasures 3, which is at least an accurate port of the arcade original.
Okay, that was Race Drivin. Sadly, it did not live up to last week's experience with Gauntlet 4, but honestly, I think there's very few games on the Genesis that could, and that failure was somewhat to be expected. I really didn't think going into this review that Race Drivin was going to blow my doors off, pun fully intended. Although, I must say, I do want to go play the arcade version now, as I want a shot at the real version of that Super Stunt Track. And as poorly as it's aged, I always enjoyed the sit-down arcade version of Hard Drivin. Maybe one day soon. Next week on Zilog and Moto, it's not what I had originally planned. See, originally, next week's slot on the calendar was supposed to be Trivial Pursuit for the Master System, since in episode 44 I reviewed the Sega CD version. But I don't have a copy of it yet. Then the next week, it was supposed to be either Micro Machines for the Master System or Micro Machines 2 for the Mega Drive, but I don't have Micro Machines 2 yet either, and the Master System version of Micro Machines only works on a Master System 2. Codemasters! Well, in more positive news, I've got both Trivial Pursuit and Micro Machines 2 on order, and next week, I guess it'll just be a surprise for everyone. Please remember to subscribe if you like this video, and remember, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later!